Good morning. Welcome back to another episode of the Ministry of Truth. I am your number one host and only host on this show. I should win a fucking radio or podcaster or streamer of the year award for complete, utter nonsense. Good morning, Smashley. How are you? Good to see you again. And the other person. Am I live on Rumble? Anyway, before we get into the topic of today, there was 3 experiments that was conducted between the year of 1954 all the way up to the Stanford experiment, which we're going to talk about today, because I did say we were going to talk about it yesterday. And it gets worse, guys. There's a whole lot more experiments that I feel like they tested it back then, and now they're using it. Because I look at these videos, I watched them this morning because I wanted to make sure I refreshed. 2 of them I didn't know about. And when I was able to tie it into the Stanford experiment, whole Stanford prison experiment. Holy shit. What's up, Bill Evans? Haven't seen you in a while. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, before we get to the topic of today, let's go through the little warm-up. This song is called Freak on a Leash. However, Freak on a Leash, if it was written and sang by Alice in Chains. How's everyone doing? Who got snow over the past week? Never see me fall from grace. Yeah, this has got a lot of fucking good things. So if you haven't checked them out, I guess I can provide you with the link. You guys enjoy it. This album sticks with me. Oh, fun fact that you probably don't care about. So when the album Follow the Leader was released, if bought it, it was still CDs unless you were using Napster. But the odd thing about that album is the first 13 tracks are blank. And then they get to 13 songs. And after that, you have Cheech singing Earache in My Eye. Yeah, those were the days when you had secret songs on CDs and shit. Oh, you must be what though? All right, bro.
During this period.
So sorry, that's nostalgic for me for some reason. It's like making me, I don't know. All right, so we're going to talk about three different experiments. One of them is the first one. We're going to go over the Robbers Cave experiment, which involved, I believe, 15-year-old boys. And, well, it's kind of like Lord of the Flies. That's the gist I'm going to get to of it. So, and this was all an experiment and fucked up these kids. You know, not that it matters because it was only an experiment on a small group of people. That they're fucking advanced, and modernized.
11 white 11-year-old boys were sent to a special
Oh, 11, I'm
remote
sorry.
summer camp in Oklahoma, Robbers Cave State Park, in the summer of 1954. Each child is unknown to one another, but they all have a few common background traits: their ethnicity, religion, and two-parent upbringing.
White Christian males.
They have been told that they'll be living together on this scout camp site, but first they must all get to know each other and pick a group name. To solidify the bond between the boys, a number of regular summer camp activities are undertaken, such as swimming, hiking, and playing games. The boys pick the name the Eagles and stencil this onto white flags. What the children didn't know was that an almost identical story was playing out with another group of 11 to 12-year-old boys across the park. And they had given themselves the name the Rattlers. Neither group is aware of one another, and they are also unaware that in just a few days' time they'll be competing against each other in a number of standard summer camp activities. What the children also don't know is that their camp counsellors are actually researchers into a psychology experiment into intergroup conflict. And the researchers had created these groups by randomly selecting and balancing attributes of the 22 boys. The result of the study would reveal the tribal mentality which has allowed us to thrive as a species, but also has been responsible for some true historical horrors. Even though both groups shared so many background similarities, the experiment will be described as the real-life Lord of the Flies. Welcome.
Testing it on our kids for this experiment. And another experiment we're going to talk about, they tested it on college students. So they get them young, and then they get them when you're that impressionable age, because 18 to 25, your brain is still forming, and it's probably the most likely to absorb the most information, because that's when you're pretty much very, very I can't think of the word. Impressionable.
To the dark side of science.
That's why they like to get soldiers young.
Our story starts not in the USA, but in the Ottoman Empire, with the birth of Muzaffar Sherif on the 29th of July 1906. Sherif, in the first 20 years of his life, would see a tumultuous time for his home country. He grew up in Odamis, located 113 kilometres south of the city of Izmir, in roughly the west of modern-day Turkey. Izmir would see occupation during the Turkish War for Independence, which ran between 1918 and 1923. Sherif would go on to college during this period, graduating in 1926 with a Bachelor of Arts from Izmir International College. His education would continue with him earning an MA from Istanbul University in 1928.
Another gate.
After discovering the works of William McDougall, he looked into the theory of instinct and social psychology. As a surprise to probably no one, McDougall was also into eugenics. It does seem like everyone was into this theory in the early 20th century.
So is Margaret Sanger.
Anyway, I digress. Sherif would enroll at Harvard in the late 1920s, gaining an MA. He would re-enroll in 1933 after a visit to Germany, although he would change to Columbia for his doctorate, earning his PhD in 1935. Upon returning to Turkey, Sherif was offered a position teaching at Ankara University. During his time at the university, he was very open about his anti-fascist views.
Okay.
At a time with Germany falling under the spell of Nazism, Sharif was highly critical of Hitler and became a communist ideological supporter. This would get him into trouble in the mid-1940s, when in 1944 he was detained with a number of Turkish Communist Party members. Turkey during World War II was a neutral power for the most part, until it sided with the Allies in February 1945. But the country was fearful of a Soviet invasion and sought to secure itself with the capitalist Western Allies. This was around the same time that Sharif decided to leave Turkey and return to the USA after being detained, in fear of a harsher punishment for his political activities, as the country looked further to the west in its political alignment. Sharif, a graduate from 2 US universities, found his Marxist views in the late 1940s a benefit to his career, as the social academic environment at the time was far more left-leaning. This led to his book The Psychology of Ego Involvements, 1947, published from Princeton University. But being left-leaning wasn't to be a benefit for too much longer, as the dark shadow of the Cold War loomed and the rise of McCarthyism. By the beginning of the 1950s, Sharif's social, political and professional ties to Turkey fell apart during the anti-communist movement. To add further insult to injury, Ankara University officially fired him, citing his marriage to a US citizen. Oh yes, I nearly forgot to talk about Carolyn, his wife. The couple met in 1945 when Carolyn, who at the time was a research assistant at Princeton University under Mr. Sharif. She had gained a master's degree in 1944 while studying under Wendell Johnson of Monster Study fame. Their professional relationship...
I think my cat just farted. You little asshole.
...developed into a personal, then romantic, culminating in their marriage in December 1945. The two would go on to produce multiple works in the psychology and social psychological fields. Okay, well, that's a little bit of a background to the experimenters. Let's look at the experiment itself. Starting in 1945, the Sharifs began to look at the field of social in-group. Let me dust off my dictionary for a second for the official definition. An in-group is a small group of people in an organisation or society whose members share the same interests, language, etc., and try to keep other people out. The Sharifs sought to artificially create in-groups amongst young boys to see if they could turn these groups against one another to study the intergroup conflict. The first experiment would take place in the summer of 1949 with 24 white 12-year-old boys from lower middle-class Protestant backgrounds at an isolated camp in Middle Grove. It would be funded by Yale University and the Department for Scientific Research of the American Jewish community.
School in Yale, huh?
The reason for all the children having the same background was to eliminate differences apart from personality between the boys. Sharif would, for the experiment, disguise himself as Mr. Musée, the camp caretaker, as a way for him to observe the behaviour of his subjects. The experiment would be formed of 3 stages. The first consisted of all the boys taking part in activities amongst each other and were allowed to form friendships. After a while, the 24 boys were divided into 2 groups. The experimenters deliberately separated the budding friendships in their selection of each cohort of 12 children. From then on, stage 2 commenced, where each group would only be allowed to interact within each other. This was to...
Sound familiar? Sound like this experiment is no longer an experiment. It's proven and run over and over again. Everywhere.
Try and establish an in-group mentality. The team buildings were conducted where a common goal appealed to all in the group. By the end of this stage, Sharif noted that friendships were bonding within the individual groups and a hierarchical structure had formed. They found that the boys preferred interacting with their own in-group over the other. Although this seems like a clean-cut hypothesis confirmation, it wasn't so perfect, but we'll discuss that later on. Now, with the 2 groups, stage 3 would involve adversarial competition. It was observed that the 2 groups would act hostile to one another.
Yes, think
and
about
although
that, like,
acting
we learned that from day one when we had, not day one, sports. even in middle school, because they have those sports, high school sports, and you have your rivals that you really, really, really want to beat every year. They be teaching that since school.
Democratically internally in their 12-strong teams, the boys didn't conduct themselves accordingly with the outgroup. Sharif tried to restore harmony at the end of the study by giving the boys a common enemy to unite against. They did this by beating a softball team from outside the camp, although tensions still existed between the two groups. With these promising results, the Sharifs sought out to expand upon the subject of in-groups. This brings us on to the 1953 Sheriff's next experiment into intergroup behaviour. The study would follow the same lines as the 1949 experiment, but would employ greater laboratory controls. We would only get to stage 2 before being terminated early.
Good.
Sharif would later say in his 1961 Robbers Cave book on the reason for the failed experiment. Owing to various difficulties and unfavourable conditions, including errors of judgment in the direction of the experiment. But Sharif's seemingly dismissive comment on the study actually glosses over the real reason, but that will be revealed later on.
Thank you.
This meant that a rerun was in order, and with the remaining grant money burning a hole in Sharif's pocket, this finally brings us on to the Robber Cave study of 1954. The rerun was planned to take place beginning in June for 3 weeks of the summer of 1954. The experiment would have 22
It's crazy
boys,
when you think all
from
these
similar-
psychological government experiments happened right after World War II. Like, bad. What's up, Yeti?
backgrounds, but vitally not to have ever had any previous interactions with one another. But where to get so many children? It's not like you can just go take a class from a school, as there would be prejudices, in-groups, microcultures, and already inevitable rivalries. All of this could muddy a potential experiment. In order to find a group large enough, a city had to be selected to find the pool of subjects. The experimenters settled on Oklahoma. Sharif decided that a maximum of 1 boy per school could be selected. Researchers were dispatched throughout the city to its many schools, and armed with higher education credentials and a letter, managed to get
So back in 1954, the 22 children had their parents sign off on something like this. What were they told it was going to be?
gain permission from the principals to go into the schoolyard to observe 5th grader boys playing. These credentials also gained access for the researchers to the children's school records. This, compared to the modern world of stranger danger, really blows my mind. Oh, the 1950s, where a degree and a letter will get you in anywhere. In total, around 200 children were selected. This will require a little more selection, down to around 50. Anyway, to cut a long story short, around 5 or 6 children per school were selected, rated top to bottom in preference, and their parents were contacted in the same order. The parents were given the same explanation of the study as the principals, that the Sharif team was looking to study the interaction of group activities within teams and how they would act during sporting activities and their attitudes towards winning or losing. The parents were explicitly told that visiting their child during the 3 weeks was prohibited and the camp would cost $25, which apparently on the inflation calculator is around $261 in 2022 money.
Jesus Christ.
Eventually the 22 participants were selected
For
and
chump
thus the
change.
experiment could begin. The overall concept of the experiment would be copied from the 1949 and failed 1953 studies, but would take a 3-stage form. Sheriff
Crazy when you
named
think
the
this is the
first
third
stage
time.
in-group formation. This would take the space of a week, where 2 groups were kept separate, and team-building exercises were undertaken to form an in-group bond within the participants. Games and treasure hunts were planned during Stage 1 to help build friendships and in-group alliances. Stage 2 would be the conflict or friction phase. This would involve a tournament between the 2 groups, consisting of sports like baseball, tug-of-war and a scavenger hunt, but also experimental tests like bean counting competitions.
Bean
A
count.
trophy was promised for the winners of the competition, as well as prizes like knives and medals. or the 1950s where pre-teens were given weapons. The third and final stage was the integration phase, where the two groups would be brought together to undertake group tasks and leisure activities of watching films. To record their findings, hidden microphones were used throughout the two groups' living areas, which were used to record conversations to observe the camaraderie within the group. The groups were also given questionnaires to fill out about their group and later about the outer group.
Oh.
On the 19th of June 1954, a coach of 11 children arrived at the Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. A day later, another group of 11 would also arrive at the camp. Both groups were unaware of the other, and throughout Stage 1, the experimenters would keep this the case by carefully managing the two's activities throughout the park. The boys would stay in log cabins alongside the Moccasin Creek, where they could swim, play and explore among the nearby woods. Each group had junior camp counsellors, who were university students.
Oh, great.
They would stay with the boys all the time, and there were also senior camp counsellors who were participant observers who stayed with the boys for around 12 hours a day. Sharif had instructed these assistants strictly to not influence the study in any way. Although there were two groups, their experience in the first few days was very similar. After the 19th of June, the first stage would begin. This began even on the coach ride to the camp, where boys in their separate coaches discussed parents and parts of the city of Oklahoma where they had come from. Games were played and the groups were encouraged to create team names, make flags and create a motto. One group took the name the Eagles, where the other took the name the Rattlers. Over the next few days, the groups were allowed to create hideouts and, using a canoe placed near each respective campsite, created their respective holdouts. In order to keep both groups separate, meal times and activities were staggered. The groups were allowed to purchase t-shirts and baseball caps for stenciling their respective group names on, as well as white sheets to be turned into flags.
Oh.
The type of language within the group
Got scared there for a second. He said turn white sheets into, and then he said flags. Okay. Ooh, I thought he was going to say ghost outfits.
addressed items as "are things," and a noticeable microculture was developing within the boys. Towards the end of the week, the two groups were allowed to find each other, and once completely confirmed by the camp workers that there was indeed another group, both groups became eager to see one another. But a slight spanner was thrown in the works. Two boys in the Eagle group had to be sent home due to homesickness. This would give an organic path to stage 2, the friction stage. The experimenters found that both groups became insistent on challenging one another to a baseball game, allowing the subjects to believe that the tournament of stage 2 was going to be their idea. The continued insistence of the groups, albeit mainly from the Rattlers, meant setting up the controlled circumstances for stage 2 became increasingly difficult. The Rattlers, upon hearing the other group was playing on the baseball field, began to use language like, "They're using our diamond," or "they're on our field." This showed that the in and out group dynamics had successfully formed, at least in the Rattlers. And thus, the experiment moved into stage 2, or the friction phase. The first day of the friction phase consisted of an informal discussion between the experimenters posing as staff and the two groups separately. These discussions informed the children of the tournament's possible prizes and assured them that every effort was being made to set everything up for the two groups to face off. Crucially, during the first day of stage 2, both groups had no physical or visual contact with one another. The different groups had different reactions to the informal announcements. The Rattlers seemed to be really excited for the competition and showed aggressive language about the other group. They appropriated the ball ground as theirs and planted a Rattler flag and made aggressive remarks about any would-be flag removers. The Eagles, on the other hand, were far less enthusiastic, with only a couple of the boys sounding particularly eager to face off. For the remainder of the day, the two groups prepared and practiced. The Eagles were showing, as the day progressed, a greater group pride when their flag was attached to a pole. On the second day, the two groups would have their first close quarters contact. Almost immediately, this broke out into name-calling and aggressive behaviour.
Of course.
The two groups had breakfast at different times, where they were introduced to the tournament exhibit, which took the form of a trophy, bladed knives and medals. After breakfast, the tournament was officially announced. The groups were informed that each game would accrue points to the winning team, and the team with the largest number of cumulative points would win the whole tournament. There was a mix of competitive activities as well as activities to be
speaking of
completed
experiments,
separately.
one of my advanced medical schools, leadership medical schools, they did an experiment. They broke up the class into two groups, obviously. One classroom, the windows were covered, all black, and that's it. You had the lecture, you couldn't look outside. It was just like being in a room with no windows and learning with a group of people. And then they had the other side of the classroom, and they had windows. They got to open them and all that. And they thought that the people had the open windows and all the light coming in would be scoring higher on the tests because it's more, welcoming. They were so wrong. The team, us that were in that room with no windows, pretty much, bro, we blew them out of water on testing. So, yeah, I don't know why that happened. I just thought of it. All right, we're going to go back to the video.
By the groups, which would be judged by the staff. The games were to consist of baseball and tug of war on the first day and second day of the competition, touch football, tent pitching and baseball on the third day, and finally a tug of war and tent pitching on the fourth. The separately completed activities were cabin inspections on the second day, as well as skits and songs. Day 3 had another cabin inspection, and day 4 had another cabin inspection and a treasure hunt.
Oh.
The second group of activities allowed experimenters to even out the score to keep the teams neck and neck for longer, thus increasing the friction between the groups. Straight off the bat, don't excuse the pun, the Rattlers won the baseball game, and the tug of war. This was evened out by the experimenters during the cabin inspections. After the first 2 days of the tournament, the cheers for the losers and good sportsmanship went out of the window, degenerating into heckling. During mealtimes, insults were thrown at each other and intergroup relations further fell apart. After the first tug of war, the defeated Eagles took the Rattlers' flag from the baseball pitch and set it alight.
Oh, shit.
The next day, the Rattlers were sent for breakfast first, in order for them to see the charred remains of their flag. In retaliation, a punch-up between the two groups ensued, and in the scuffle, a member of the Rattlers grabbed and burned the Eagle flag. The next tug of war on the second day resulted in a strong win for the Eagles. Frustrated in this, and fueled with anger from the flag burning, the Rattlers set about planning a raid of their adversary's camp. In the night around 10:30 p.m, the Rattlers group hit the Eagles' cabin, turning beds and ripping window screens, stealing comic books and even clothing. The next day during lunch, the Eagles hit the Rattlers' cabin, doing the same amount of damage. The Rattlers by now had also replaced their burnt flag with a stolen pair of trousers, much to the annoyance of the Eagles. The competitions continued and were manipulated in such a way that by the last day of the competitions it was neck and neck and pivoted on the final task, the treasure hunt. Because the hunt was separate between the two groups, again this result could be manipulated in the favour of the smaller Eagle group. Right at the end of the hunt, both teams were brought out in front of the trophy and prizes, and the winners were the Eagles.
Oh, shit.
The Eagles did the hunt in 8 minutes and 38 seconds, and the Rattlers did theirs in 10 minutes and 15 seconds.
And they only had 8
was
people.
Night and day between the group's reactions.
Remember, the
Eagles
Rattlers,
gleeful.
or the Eagles, I think it was the Eagles, they had to send 2 people home. So it's already 11-9.
In the win, shouting and jumping, juxtaposed to the Rattlers' dejected sitting watching the winners celebrate. The Eagles went off to the creek to swim and play in victory. This must have grated on the defeated group, and they planned to even the score.
Oh, I thought they would have
The Rattlers again raided the Eagles' camp, and in doing so stole the knives and medals which had just been won.
Oh.
Upon finding out, the Eagles squared off against the Rattlers, and a fight looked like it was about to break out. A couple of the boys scuffled, but quickly this was broken up by the staff. The Rattlers' observers herded the group back up the path to their camp. A staff member returned some of the prizes to the Eagles, but it was clear that neither group wanted to have anything to do with the other. And thus the experiment now moved into its final stage, integration.
Uh-oh. So they're almost on the final phase where all groups are completely segregated. You know. Wink, wink. And the real world. There's so many applications you can apply this to right now. Everything. In everything. And there we go.
Sharif and his team had created two groups who had become arch enemies. This hatred was not from racial, religious or cultural backgrounds, but purely from being
common arch enemies. Think about it. Who are the main people? Right? Who makes them think the other guy's bad? Right? When you throw in competition, you know, as in like, I don't know, trade and all that shit. One part makes it cheaper, the other one's gonna make it cheaper, but at a less quality. And I don't know where I was going with this because I just fucking got a brain fart.
arbitrarily selected into a group by a third party. Initially, it was thought that just exposure of the two groups to one another.
Yo, it's kind of like the show Survivor too.
Between the two. Sharif tried group meals and watching movies in the recreation hall. During these scenarios, the staff
actually Survivor is a great example
during the
of
initial
that.
contact, seating was freely available.
Holy
thus
shit!
Giving the opportunity
normalized
for the
it.
groups to intermingle. And before each meal or film, the groups were made to wait near each other. But almost all
Think about
interactions
it. If
devolved
you've ever
into
watched Amazing Race or Survivor or any of those reality competitions, you find yourself picking a team or picking a certain player. Huh.
arguments and insults. During a lunchtime, unsurprisingly, both groups had chosen seats with one another, and again it devolved into insults and even a food fight. In order to bring the groups together, Sharif decided that stage 3 would include introducing a common goal. The experimenters engineered a fault with the water system. This was done by turning off the tap from the camp's water tank and covering over the area with two boulders.
Oh.
It was hoped that the perceived deprivation of water would bring both groups together. They were told that vandals had
Hell
done
no,
this
that just makes
before
them more
in
angry.
order to absolve blame from either group or the staff, and were told that at least 25 people were needed to find the issue and fix it, thus requiring at least both teams to cooperate. After the combined effort of both groups fixed the water issue, many of the boys went off to catch lizards, play and carve wood whistles. But interestingly, the children weren't working within their groups, but had separated off, intermingling. But the intergroup friction continued to persist when the groups were separated for dinner, leading to more insults and arguing. Another engineered cooperation task was securing the film Treasure Island. The children were told that the camp couldn't afford the $15 for the film. As most of the children wanted to see the film, it was suggested that both groups could contribute some money. After some initial hostilities of saying either group should pay the full amount, eventually a mutually acceptable amount was agreed upon, where both groups paid an equal sum of $3.50, and the staff paid the rest. Although the $3.50 was not individually equal, as the Eagles only had 9 members, the breakdown of intergroup hostility showed some progress. During the negotiations, the boys intermingled again by playing and talking. The next day, the two groups agreed to take turns in going first for lunch and dinner. Towards the end of stage 3, a campout was planned at Cedar Lake, which would involve a truck ride including both groups. Once at the lake, there was another engineered issue, this time with the truck, requiring all the boys to take part in a tug of war, not against themselves,
But the truck.
instead against the stricken vehicle.
Oh, I'm gonna beat that truck.
After several attempts of pulling the vehicle, the truck restarted and both groups erupted into jubilant celebration across group lines. The next day, a trip to Arkansas was announced. This, unlike before, was seen as agreeable by both parties for the other to come along. For the final dinner back at the Robbers Cave site, the experimenters mixed around the seating from before, as to encourage more intermingling. Both groups, as they had done before, lined up, but interestingly, after collecting their food, all of the boys sat together across group boundaries. During the evening's discussion, the idea was posited that they all travelled back home on the same bus. Although a couple of dissenting opinions were voiced, the majority seemed to look forward to the proposition of all travelling together. Even on the journey home and a stop for refreshments, the Rattlers agreed that a $5 prize they had won be spent on drinks for everyone, regardless of group. It seemed as if Sharif's hypothesis was correct, in that he could create two groups from almost identical backgrounds to hate one another. The experiment also showed that within the groups a hierarchy was formed with high and low status individuals, all without the encouragement of the adults. It was discovered that in-group stability increased when put into competitive situations with an outgroup, and out-group hostility also increased. He also discovered that just exposing the two groups without competition during stage 3 didn't reduce hostility, and as such group goals needed to be enacted to try and improve intergroup relations. The ultimate result was, although intergroup friction is increased when competition is included, it can be reduced, thus meaning in the wider world intergroup relations can be improved. At the end of stage 2, Sharif found that intergroup friendships were around 93%, but by the end of the third stage this had dropped to around 75%, meaning that boundaries have been blurred by the use of superordinate goals. The study has been used as a practical example of realistic conflict theory, where intergroup hostility can arise as a result of competition over limited resources. It doesn't matter, however, if it's real or perceived. This theory has many extensions to explaining
real or perceived. And that's what's going on. Nobody sees what's real. They just take an opinion or a news source and then that's it. That's it. Create that division. Stoke it. Give it more fucking wood. Throw some gas on it. Gaslighting.
Racism, xenophobia, and in general our human desire for tribalism, or the exclusion of the other. Take football, or soccer if you're American games for example. People from essentially very similar backgrounds shout hatred and abuse to one another in the stands, just because two teams are playing against one another on the pitch. The spectators probably have more in common with one another than the millionaire sportsmen that they are cheering on. But what of the criticism? Well, there is a long list of both moral and scientific issues here. Morality, the use of children who by design were not aware of the experiment couldn't give informed consent, and their parents and teachers as well were not given the full concept of what the boys were going to be involved in. This, however, does play into Sharif's stated reliability of the experiment's results. But the scientific validity of the study has also been criticised. This is due to the odd vibes during the experiment, where staff members did not exactly act like they were actually staff. Instead of breaking up fights, they took photographs. Instead of telling of poor behaviour, they took notes. This was clearly not subtle, as the reason for the 1953 study ending early was likely due to the fact the children kept on asking why there were microphones hanging in their camp.
Smart
the
kids.
Ultimate discovery of a notebook with observations of the children written in. The children, instead of forming into two groups, actually rallied against the experimenters, thus
the common enemy
theory. In the Robbers Cave experiment of 1954,
think about that, right? Think about it. Oh, sorry. The big guy, right? He sits back as the hostility created within the groups, right? Like we have now, Republicans, Democrats, Nunionites, and I guess I don't really know who's on the other side now. But created the division. I don't know who. Actually, I kind of have a good idea. But once people wake up, it's called an awakening, right? Just like in America, everyone found a common goal. We want our money. We want prices back down. Both sides were like, oh shit, everything is expensive. And this guy's actually trying to promise to bring prices down instead of, saying that it's the other side's fault that it's like this. People don't see it. It's right there in front of you every fucking day. And I'm so glad I thought about these fucking experiment last night. And then watching some streams from the past couple days, especially one from early this morning. It's sad. It really is. Because the whole stream was pretty much saying, fuck them, fuck this. And the same thing for the other side. It's stupid. It's the same shit. Y'all are both fucking morons. And I'm glad I fucking stay out of your bullshit now. Anyway, let's continue.
The assertion of Sherif that the adults had no
What's up, short
influence
bus?
over the children is clearly wrong, as Stage 2 was manipulated to increase the tension between the groups. Even one of the group's names, the Rattlers, was influenced by the boys witnessing one of the adults shooting a snake. The fact that the staff did not act like normal camp workers could have played up the reaction of the boys to be
What do you
more
mean, do I have a
aggressive.
fan on Yeti? Do you hear something weird? Because it's not on.
Also, there was no control group, which also brings up issues of the experiment's result validity. How can we know for certain if the groups would become hostile, have food fights, and shout abuse at each other at a normal camp where staff wouldn't intervene and stop the bad behaviour? Furthermore, it could be normal for boys who started out as enemies to end up as friends after 3 weeks.
Yeah, that's like the
regardless
crazy
of the
thing.
superordinate.
Like growing up, if you got into a fist fight in school, one of two things happened. You avoided each other, or you became friends.
Goals set out by the experimenters, leading to Sherif placing more weight on the results and
Exactly,
attributing the
short bus.
children's actions
And that's
to
the thing.
his
When I
realistic.
first showed up, that's what it was about. I didn't even know there were sides, to be honest. And then suddenly, panels from friendliness went to shit talking, kind of like the experiment here. One common cause, bring them all together, let them go, and see what happens. See what happens. They forgot the common goal, but I'm not going to talk about this shit anymore because I'm talking on deaf ears when it comes to that.
Conflict theory.
Not saying you guys,
would
but
become a cornerstone
you guys know what I
of
mean.
realistic conflict theory and put the Sherifs into the Hall of Fame of experimental psychologists. But multiple modern re-evaluations of the experiment have disputed this. In Gina Perry's book, The Lost Boys, which during her research went through all the material from the experiment, found that there was more backstage manipulation than originally thought. The way the Robbers Cave experiment book is written glosses over the manipulation in its neutral language, as Gina pointed out. What is interesting, however, is how the 1953 study actually proved the better nature of the children, in that they stayed friends and turned against the experimenters. Now, where would you rate this experiment on my ethical scale? I'm going to say
like I
around
said
a
right
7,
now, this
due to
shit's
the
not an experiment. This shit's real world. It's happening from the smallest part of the internet communities to the fucking broader thing. Like, oh my god, we don't like China. We don't like Russia. We're telling you not to like Russia. We're telling you not to like China. We're telling you not to like Palestinians. We're telling you to like Israel. We're telling you to like Ukraine. Come on, man.
How?
All right. Now, more psychological experiments. This one involves electroshock therapy. This is from 1963. I believe this actually involved students from Yale. I could be wrong, but I know it was one of the Ivy League schools. This is called the Milgram experiment.
How can a regular person be talked into committing heinous acts upon another? And could you be convinced to potentially injure or kill someone
Pay
else?
attention really close to this.
I'm not talking about self-defense or during war on the battlefield, but someone you have never met before and have had no interaction with previously. How can perfectly normal people commit genocide? Like what we saw in the 1930s and 1940s in Europe, or even in Cambodia in the 1970s, amongst other events. What causes people to be active participants in crimes against humanity? If we take Germany in the 1930s as an example, what caused a large part of a modern country to be willing in crimes against people that have been their neighbours and community members for years? It is a really fascinating thought experiment, as when you think to yourself, I could never do something like this, or even this. But what would it actually take for you to pull a trigger, push a button, or pull a lever? Well, this is where a psychologist set out to see what would be the minimum amount of suggestion for a regular person to administer a potentially deadly electric shock to someone they have never met before. The simple but effective study would be known by the inventor's name, the Milgram experiment. The actual experiment would not result in any physical pain, but extreme stress and inflicted insight to the participants. And this would create controversy with the study. As such, I'm going to rate it here 5 on my ethics scale. This is mainly due to it being a fascinating dive into our hardwired ability to obey an authority figure, even to the point of murder. Welcome to the dark side of science.
For them, it's the dark side of science. For me, you're hearing it through my mind, because this is the shit that I talk about. This is why I don't trust the government. And this is why I don't trust this fucking new AI Stargate project.
Stanley Milgram was an American social psychologist born on the 15th of August 1933 in the Bronx, New York. His parents were Jewish and had fled Romania and Hungary during the First World War. His background and
Jewish, huh? So we took Nazi doctors and we take our marching orders from the Jews. That's crazy.
Family ties to Europe would have an important effect on his later studies into social psychology. As word came back to the Milgram family during the late 30s and 40s of the atrocities inflicted by the Nazi regime. Although in relative safety in the USA, many of Stanley's family members were directly
really surprised. Oh, fuck, I forgot what I was going to say.
Affected by the Holocaust. After the war, some surviving...
So all these leftists that, like, free Palestine, fuck Israel, fuck them. Trump is Hitler. Hitler hated the Jews. So, you saying you actually do support Trump? Huh? Free Palestine.
Members of the family came to stay whilst finding a new life in the US. A young Stanley was exposed to the horrors experienced by his relatives, and this would stay with him, igniting an interest into the darker side of human nature. In 1954, Milgram received his bachelor's degree in political science from Queen's College in New York. Initial applications to Harvard for a psychology master's were rejected, but was eventually admitted. The initial setbacks were due to Milgram not taking any undergraduate courses in psychology at Queen's College. In 1961, Milgram received a PhD in social psychology. He became an assistant professor at Yale around the same time. Later on, he served as an assistant professor in the Department of Social Relations at Harvard from 1963 to 1966. And this brings us very quickly onto his obedience study, more commonly known as the Milgram experiment. Stanley's experience of relatives going through the Holocaust, coupled with the arrest and trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, sparked an interest into finding out what could make seemingly average people take part in atrocities. Eichmann organised the logistics of the deportation of Jews during the Holocaust. He made deportation plans down to the last detail. Working with other German agencies, he also determined how the property of deported Jews would be seized. What was interesting about the trial was that he claimed he had not dictated policy but only carried it out, and that he was merely a cog in the machinery of destruction. Essentially, the "I was only following orders" defence. This highlights the question, that is following an order enough to convince someone to do something so heinous? Milgram would later say in 1974, when explaining the experiment, could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices? The experiment was pretty simple and would make use of three people: the experimenter, who was in charge of the session, the teacher, a volunteer for a single session, and a learner. Both the teacher and learner would arrive for the session together, and they would draw straws as to who would take each role. Participants were sourced via a newspaper ad saying, "We will pay you for 1 hour of your time in a study of memory." The teacher and learner, after finding out their roles, were taken into a room where the learner was strapped into what appeared to be an electric chair, and electrode paste was applied to the learner's wrist to prevent blistering and burns. The teacher would hear this being explained and see this happen. The experimenter, who was dressed in a lab coat in order to appear to have more authority, told the participants that restraints was to ensure that the learner would not escape. The teacher was allowed to experience a sample electric shock similar to what the learner would feel. Before beginning the experiment, the volunteers were informed that they would be paid regardless of the outcome, thus removing any financial incentive to any results. The teacher was led into another room where they could not see the learner but could hear them, and the experiment would begin. The teacher was then given a list of word pairs that...
I hate to just keep interrupting. Think about the Kingsman. I think it's the Kingsman. When it came to the dogs,
he was to teach the learner. The teacher would then read the first word of each pair and read 4 possible answers. The learner would press a button to show his answer. If incorrect, the teacher was meant to administer a shock to the learner. If correct, the teacher would read the next.
And the way this one, they can't see each other. If I remember right, there's a really thin wall, but they can't see each other.
Pair of words. Each subsequent incorrect answer would mean the teacher had to increase the voltage in 15-volt increments. They were also instructed to announce the voltage before shocking the learner. Pretty cruel, you might think, but there was only one actual volunteer in each test, the teacher, who, unbeknownst to them, was the real test subject. You see, the learner was actually a stooge and wasn't receiving an electrical shock, and the chance drawing of straws to find out who would do either role was actually fixed, meaning the teacher would always be the teacher. Also, probably not surprising, the experimenter was also in on it. This meant that the whole experience of the teacher was controlled from the authority of the experimenter to the reaction of the learner. To ramp things up...
No, this is Javionomics. Javiology.
In later versions of the study, the learner would also shout out in pain when the voltage got too high. The experiment would have a preliminary and a regular run. The first was a practice of sorts, where the learner would get 3 correct answers and 7 incorrect ones, which would yield a shock up to 105 volts. The second, or regular run, the teacher would be told to read off a list of words and had to continue repeating it until the learner had gotten all of the pairs correct. The volt dial ranged from 15 to 450 volts, and to add further explanation for the teacher was labelled slight shock to danger severe shock. Above 300 volts, the learner would kick on the wall and then no longer give answers to the teacher's multiple choice questions. If the teacher showed any hesitation, the experimenter was able to give one of 4 prodding responses in sequence. The first was "please continue" or "please go on," followed by "the experiment requires that you to continue," and then "it is absolutely essential that you continue," and finally "you have no other choice, you must."
Think about that. If they tell you there's no option, or like, hey, continue on the experiment, they pretty much go from being nice to pretty much telling you there's no other choice, that you have to shock them. I mean, you have a choice. Do you shock them because that's what they want you to do? Or do you have a moral compass? Well, you're going to be surprised. what this experiment shows and why I think this experiment is also important to today's society. Think about getting canceled. You can't say certain things or you get canceled. You can't talk about COVID before or you would get censored and canceled.
Must go on. The experimenter could only progress
did,
to the next
$4
point
whether
if
they
the
get
teacher refused.
Finished or not.
If all 4 responses were reached, then the experiment would end. If not, it would continue all the way up to 450 volts. If the teacher asked any specific questions, the experimenter could reply. For example, will the shock leave any permanent damage? The experimenter could then reply with, although shocks can be extremely painful, they cause no permanent damage. After the experiment, an interview would be undertaken, and the question, how painful do you think the last few shocks you administered were? The teachers were instructed to indicate their answer on a scale between 1 to 14, after which the teacher was reintroduced to the learner and the experiment was fully explained. The experiments began in July 1961 at Yale University, and 40 subjects would volunteer through this newspaper advert.
Yale.
And the results would surprise all predictions. The 40 men were from a cross-section in society from various different age and career groups, ranging from 20 to 50. During the experiment, most test subjects showed signs of severe distress when administering the electric shock. They were observed sweating, trembling, stuttering, biting their lips, groaning, and digging their fingernails into their own skin. The discomfort seen shown that the subjects were aware of the pain the learner was experiencing. Pre-experiment, it was expected that only a small amount of the subjects would administer the high voltage shock, between 1 and 3%, but this prediction would be way off. Of the 40 subjects, all reached 300 volts, at which the learner would bang on the wall and stop giving answers. Only 5 refused to go beyond this point. 4 more went on to shock the learner one more time and then also refused. 2 stopped at the 330 volt level, and 1 each at 345, 360 and 375 volts respectively, meaning that only 14 refused the experimenter's prods. This meant that 26 proceeded all the way to the end, giving the highest available shock to the learner. Although most showed signs of discomfort and stress, they still obeyed the perceived authority of a guy in a white lab coat. The results were understandably unexpected, as from a young age we are taught to not hurt others, but with the addition of an authority figure, the teacher would abandon this fundamental part of their moral fabric. Scarily, there was no punishment for disobeying the experimenter, nor was there any reward for completing the experiment, as payment was assured from the start. Even more strange was the results were similar when a control study was undertaken with 43 unpaid students. In Milgram's paper into the study, he highlighted several particular conditions of the experiment that might have contributed to the high level of about 65% of compliance to the highest voltage level. The fact that the study was being undertaken at and sponsored by Yale possibly reassured subjects that the experiment was above board and reputable. The perceived randomness of the selection of learner and teacher also could have factored in, as a teacher may have thought that he could have been in the other chair, hence he was exposed to the same risks. The subject may have also have thought that as he had volunteered that he was obligated to help the experimenter, and to the same extent that the learner had also submitted to the authority of the experiment. The subjects were also reassured that although painful, the shocks were not deadly, and that compliance was built through to shock level 20 when the learner would no longer reply.
Me being me, I'm like, alright, I understand you want me to do this. Can I see what it's like to get 100 volts real quick? 100, 150? Just let me hit it up. Why? I just want to know how it feels. Because if I know how it feels, 20 volts ain't shit. That's just enough to go, ow. Hook me up. Hook me up. That's just me. And I don't follow directions very well anyway. I like to question.
To refuse would cause a conflict situation where the wants of the learner and the experimenter were at odds with one another, and to side with the experimenter was the path of least resistance, so to speak. The short duration that the experiment ran for meant that the teacher had less time to think about the actions, resulting in little time for reflection. Milgram would repeat the experiment in several variations to see if any of the conditions changed would yield different results. Even when Milgram conducted the experiment in an unregistered office far away from Yale, the results were fairly similar. Now to the ethical question, was the experiment cruel? Well, in my opinion, no.
Everyone that went above 300, shit, anybody that went above 200, come on. Those are the followers. They show you this is bad, this is what could happen, when in reality they're not really doing anything. But they put that fear into you, and it makes you a follower. As sad as it is, MAGA is a big example. It really is. What do we have on the left? BLM, but BLM's falling apart. The movement's pretty much forgotten about. The organization is fucking bankrupt. Hell, Patrisse Cullors lost all her Los Angeles homes. Do I feel bad for her? Fuck no, she scammed people out of money. Oh shit, that sounds familiar.
But it can leave long-term distress to the teacher, especially if they administered the full shock. For many, the experience left self-reflection on how they had submitted to the authority of the experimenter. Ethical criticism came from the allowed discomfort of the test subjects, where even though they had provided their consent, the experiment should have been paused when the distress was observed.
Exactly.
However, in his 1974 book, Obedience to Authority, An Experimental View, pushed back on his detractors, saying that the ethical criticism provoked by his experiments was because his findings were disturbing and revealed unwelcome truths about human nature. It is really open to debate as whether the experiment was ethical or not, but regardless, it was a fascinating dive into human nature. The study would later be compared with another controversial experiment run by one of Milgram's friends, Philip George Zimbardo, at Stanford. But that will be a subject for another video.
Oh yeah.
Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. This video is a plain...
What do y'all think about that experiment? It's happening. These first two experiments, you see how they relate to today's real world. It's sad that many people, through all the test subjects, went all the way up to 450, whether they're paid or not. That's sad. It's an experiment. They're telling you to ask questions and shock people. Aren't you going to ask why? I want to know what this experiment's really for. And, like, legit, I want to try the 125. Because I know that's definitely going to be uncomfortable. But we'll see. We'll see, because, you know, it was just an experiment, guys. They haven't done that on a larger scale. Never. No, they wouldn't do that. Now would they? Or do you believe the government? Now let's skip to Stanford. This one's, I don't know if I want to do this one first. We're going to do the BBC documentary first, and then we're going to go into some raw footage, and then I think that'll be it. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present to you, as promised, the Stanford Prison Experiment.
I was the first one to be picked up, so they put me in a cell. They locked me in there in this degrading little outfit.
Hey, I don't want anybody left. Violation of the rules, simulation! I gotta go to a doctor, anything. Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside, don't you know?
Oh. I can't remember the this inmate's number, but it's one that they're gonna very, very focus on as part of the prison group. I think it's like 619 or 819, something like that.
I've never screamed so loud in my life. Never been so upset in my life. It was an experience of being out of control.
fucking can't take it.
Alright, fair warning, last time I tried to do something on this one, I got hit by YouTube. So, hopefully it doesn't happen this time.
Stanford University, Northern California, one of America's most prestigious academic institutions, and in 1971, the scene of one of the most notorious experiments in the...
Dude, look at the building number for the psychology department.
...history of psychology.
I was interested in what happens if you put good people in an evil place. Does the situation outside of you, the institution, come to control your behavior, or does the things inside of you, your attitudes, your values, your morality, allow you to rise above a negative environment?
The negative environment Zimbardo chose to test his ideas was a prison. He would convert the basement of the university's psychology department into a subterranean jail.
We put prison doors on each of 3 office cells. In the cells, there was nothing but 3 beds, and there was actually very little room, if anything else, because they were very small. And here we had solitary confinement, which we call the hole. And in the hole was the place where prisoners would be put for punishment. It was a very, very small area. When you closed the door, it was totally dark. All the guards wore military uniforms, and we had them wear these silver reflecting sunglasses.
I remember, even the guards are part of the experiment. They're fucking playing the role. They're the subject as well.
And what it does is you can't see someone's eyes, and so that loses some of the humanness, the humanity. In general, we wanted to create a sense of power. That is, the guards, as a category, are people who have power over others. In this case, power over the prisoners.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust, he set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Will you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse. Rock. House. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer. Horse.
Oh. Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
You refuse to go on? The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
Oh. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
You
here.
can't stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man.
180 volts, and all you do
Who's
is,
gonna take the
ow!
responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
2/3 of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering with less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis. Like Milgram, Zimbardo was interested in the power of social situations to overwhelm individuals. His experiment would test people's responses to an oppressive regime. Would they accept it or act against it? Zimbardo's experiment was conducted against a backdrop of civil rights activism and protest against the Vietnam War.
There was a sense of student power, student dominance, and student rebellion against authority in general.
It was from the student body that Zimbardo selected his participants. After passing tests to screen out anyone with a psychological abnormality, they were paid $15 a day. Each was randomly assigned to the role of guard or prisoner.
It was a prison to me. It still is a prison to me. I don't look on it as an experiment or a simulation. It was just a prison that was run by psychologists instead of run by the state.
Sort of how?
I was 20, and that September I was going to college, and it would be nice to have a summer job, but there sure wasn't a lot of time left. And I looked in the want ads, and I found this thing which was just going to fit. It was just 2 weeks.
Once you put a uniform on and are given a job to keep these people in line, you really become that person. Once you put on that khaki uniform, you put on the glasses, you take the nightstick.
I was on summer break from my first year in college, and I was looking for a job. Had to choose between that and making pizzas. That sounded like a lot more fun.
As well as running the experiment, Zimbardo took on the role of prison superintendent. He began by briefing the guards.
I said, you have to maintain law and order. If prisoners escape, the study is over, and you can't use physical violence.
You can create a sense of fear in them. You can create the notion that their life is totally controlled by us, and that there'll be constant surveillance. We have total power in the situation, and they have none.
Prisoners were brought to the basement prison, blindfolded, to confuse them about their whereabouts. They were stripped and deloused.
Of course, the guards started making fun of their genitals and humiliating them. And really, it's the start of what's known as the degradation process, which not only prisons, but lots of military-type outfits use that process.
When I first got here, even though I had to strip, when they would call me names, I still didn't feel at all like I was in the prison. I was just looking at it as a job.
I recall sort of walking up and down the very short hallway, which was the prison hall, and looking in on the prisoners, and they're basically lounging around on their beds. I felt it was like the day in summer camp.
The first day I said, this might be a very long, very boring experiment, because it's conceivable nothing will happen.
I arrived independently at the conclusion that this experiment must have been put together to prove a point about prisons being a cruel and inhumane place, and therefore I would do my part, to help those results come about. I was a confrontational and arrogant 18-year-old at the time, and
Who hasn't been?
I said somebody ought to stir things up a bit here.
On the second morning, the prisoners had decided to stir things up as well. The guards found some of them had used their beds to barricade their cell. Prisoner 8612 was one of the ringleaders of the rebellion.
Initially, I was stunned. I didn't expect a rebellion because not much happened. I mean, it wasn't clear what they were rebelling against, but they were rebelling against the status, rebelling against being anonymous, against having to follow orders from these other students.
As punishment for the rebellion, prisoner 8612 was put in the hole, and the guards turned on the other prisoners.
The guards felt that they now have to up the ante of being tough. The prisoners made the mistake of beginning to use profanity against the guards in a very personalized way. So not against the guards, but, you little punk, you big shit, and so forth. And the guards got furious.
Everybody out! Well, gentlemen, here it is time for count.
Prisoners were repeatedly woken in the middle of the night. The guards made them do menial, physical tasks and clean out toilets with their bare hands.
We made it a point to not give them any sense of comfort or what to expect, that anything could happen to them at any time, including being rousted from their sleep at any hour and forced to stand up in a line and have me hurl insults at them and make them do exercises. When you interrupt people's sleep, they tend to become a little disoriented. And since there was no daylight in the prison, they had no idea whether it was night or day.
True. Very true.
I think that I was the instigator of this whole schedule of harassment.
The harassment of the guards took its toll on rebellion leader 8612. He told Zimbardo he wanted to leave the experiment. Zimbardo responded not as a psychologist, but as a prison superintendent.
Oh. I said, well, I can see to it the guards don't hassle you personally, and in return, all I would like is some information from time to time about what the prisoners are doing. So essentially I'm saying, I'd like you to be a snitch, an informer. And I said, think it over, and if you still want to leave, fine.
Confused, prisoner 8612 returned to his cell and told the other prisoners that no one could leave.
He believed that we wouldn't let him go, although we've never said that. But the fact that he was the ringleader of the rebellion, and he told the other prisoners, they won't let you leave. And that really transformed the experiment into a prison.
I was told that I couldn't quit. And at that point, I just felt totally hopeless. More hopeless than I'd ever felt before.
Soon after returning to his cell, prisoner 8612 started showing signs of severe distress.
God damn it! You're fucked up! You don't know, I mean, God! I mean, Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside, don't you know? I just fucking can't take it.
He came up with a plan that if he acted crazy, we would have to release him.
Okay.
I'm so fucked up inside. I feel really fucked up inside. You don't know. I gotta go. To a doctor, anything. I can't say that. I'm fucked up. I don't know how to explain it. I'm all fucked up inside.
Ah, dude.
It starts with make-believe, and then he's doing it and cursing and screaming and, you know, whatever that little boundary is that he moved across. Not that he became really crazy, but he became, you know, excessively disturbed. I mean, so much so that we immediately said we have to release him.
As an experience, it was unique. I've never screamed so loud in my life. I've never been so upset in my life. And it was an experience of being out of control.
The boundary between reality and make-believe was to become blurred even for Zimbardo. A rumor circulated that released prisoner 8612 would return with friends to liberate the remaining prisoners.
Oh, shit.
I quickly convinced myself that, you know, my most important function was, you know, not to allow this prison liberation to occur. And what could I do to keep my prison going, not the experiment going?
The prison was dismantled and the prisoners moved to another part of the building. Zimbardo waited in the empty corridor, preparing to tell 8612 and his friends that the study was over, when a colleague appeared and began asking questions about the scientific basis of the research.
I'm trying to get rid of him. Then he says, what's the independent variable? I get furious because he doesn't understand that there's a riot about to take place, that this prison is about to erupt. I had totally lost this whole other identity of scientist, researcher, psychologist.
The rumored jailbreak never materialized.
Oh.
The guards had...
So, the experimenter subconscious became the experimentee as well. How fucking deep into this were they going?
Dismantled the prison for nothing and had to rebuild it. They took their frustration out on the prisoners. The rumored jailbreak never materialized. The guards had dismantled the prison for nothing and had to rebuild it.
Oh.
They took their frustration out on the prisoners.
They escalated again the level of control, the level of dominance, the level of humiliating behavior.
"819 was the next prisoner to rebel against the harassment of the guards. He barricaded himself in his cell and refused to take part in the count.
You're not only not getting a cigarette, but for as long as the cell's blockaded, you're going to be in solitary when you get out.
All right.
For 819's disobedience, the guards made his cellmates do mindless work. This undermined any vestige of solidarity amongst the prisoners, who now chose to accept the tyranny of the guards rather than risk further harassment.
That was one of the surprising things to me, is that there was so little that the prisoners did to support one another after we started our campaign of, divide and conquer.
Isolated and distraught, prisoner 819 told Zimbardo he wanted to leave.
While I'm interviewing 819 and saying, okay, it's all over, thank you for your participation, I'll give you money for the whole 2 weeks, even though you're leaving early, he hears the prisoners shouting, 819 did a bad thing.
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing.
2 minutes of
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing.
And he said, I can't leave. And he's crying. And he says, I can't leave. I said, what do you mean you can't leave? He said, no, I have to go back because I don't want them to think that I'm a bad prisoner. And that's when I really flipped out. That in such a short time, a college student's thinking could become so distorted. I said, you're not a bad prisoner. You're not a prisoner. And this is not a prison. And it was this thing where he opened his eyes. And it was just really like a cloud being lifted.
Seeing things clearly, prisoner 819 reverted to his original request and was released. To replace him, the experimenters called in one of their reserves from the standby list.
I got a phone call saying, are you still available as an alternate? Kind of cheery female secretary voice. I said, yes, sure. And so she said, could you start this afternoon? And I said, yes, sure. And my role in the experiment really began. I was blindfolded and then stripped and supposedly deloused.
Is that a box on his head?
He came into a madhouse, full blown. All of us had gradually acclimated to the increasing level of aggression, the increasing powerlessness of the prisoners, the increasing dominance of the guards. And he comes in and says, what's happening here to the other prisoners? And they said, yeah, you better not make trouble. It's really terrible. It's a real prison. And he says, I'm out of here. I don't want to. And they said, no, you can't leave. Once you're here, you're stuck. This is a real prison.
416, since you got your hands in the air, why don't you play Frankenstein? 293, you can be the bride of Frankenstein. You stand here.
Prisoner 416 was soon subjected to the harassment of Dave Eshelman, nicknamed John Wayne because of his macho attitude.
416, I want you to walk over here like Frankenstein and say that you love 293.
I made the decision that I would be as intimidating, as cold, as cruel as possible.
I love you, 293. Get up close. Get up close. I love you, 293. I love you, 293. You smile, 293. You get down here and do 10 push-ups. 2, 3.
I just watched a movie called Cool Hand Luke, and the mean, intimidating, Southern prison warden character in that film really was my inspiration for the role that I created for myself.
Why is it you try to be obedient so much?
It's my nature to be obedient, Mr. Reginald.
You a liar. You a stinking liar.
He was creative in his evil. He would think up very ingenious ways to degrade, to demean the prisoners.
What if I told you to get down on that floor?
I mean, I've come up with a better way to help people.
What would you do then?
Haven't done it.
One of the best guards was also on that shift, and instead of confronting this bad guard, the sadistic guard, essentially because he didn't want to see what was happening, he became the gopher. He would go out to get the food and things of this kind, and that left the John Wayne guard and another guard on that shift to be dominant.
We were continually called upon to act in a way that just is contrary to what I really feel inside. Just continually giving out shit. It's just really one of the most oppressive things you can do.
416, while they do push-ups, you sing Amazing Grace. Ready? Down. Keep going. Grace. You do push-ups on your own.
The madness of the experiment started to affect prisoner 416.
A wretch like me. Keep going.
I began to feel that I was losing my identity until finally I wasn't Clay. I was 416. I was really my number. And 416 was going to have to decide what to do.
Damn.
Prisoner 416 decided to go on a hunger strike.
They were.
That's fucking crazy, because Now think about that. In basic training, you have a roster number. You don't have a name. In airborne school, you have a roster number. You don't have a name. Air assault school, you have a roster number. You don't have a name. Huh.
We're pushing my limits, but here was a thing that I could do that could push their limits. After I had missed a couple of meals, I saw that this was not a matter of indifference to the guards. I was making headway. They were upset.
I thought, how dare this newcomer come in and try to change everything that we had worked for the first 3 days to set up, and by God, he's going to suffer for that.
Get in that private van.
Frustrated by his continued defiance, John Wayne threw prisoner 416 into the hole.
Oh.
After punishing the other prisoners for his disobedience, John Wayne encouraged them to vent their anger at 416 directly.
Like the party? Oh.
Okay, 209, please.
Thank you, 416.
We would use our nightsticks to bang on the door, and we would kick the door so hard that, it must have, shaken him very seriously inside, scared the life out of him.
He yelled at me and threatened me and actually sort of smashed a sausage into my face to try to get me to
find sausage.
Open up. But I didn't have any intention of eating until I was out.
416 should have been at some level a hero, because he's willing to oppose the authority of the system. In fact, the prisoners accept the guards' definition of him as a troublemaker.
I remember some of them saying, would you eat, goddammit? We're sick and tired of this. And, that was proof that, there was no solidarity, there was no support between the prisoners.
While 416 was still in the hole, John Wayne made a final attempt to break him by giving his fellow prisoners a choice. They could vote to release him by making a small sacrifice.
You can give me the blankets and sleep on the bare mattress, or you can keep your blankets and 416 will stay in another day.
Yeah, fuck you, I'm keeping my blanket.
Now what will it be?
I'll keep my blanket.
What will it be over here?
I'll keep my blanket.
How about 5486?
I'll give you my blanket, Mr. Correctional Officer.
You don't want his blanket. We got 3 in favor of keeping the blanket.
We got 3, guess 1. Keep your blankets. 416, you're going to be in there for a while. So just get used to it.
The study showed that power corrupts, and how difficult it is for people who are the victims of abuse to stand up and defend themselves. Why doesn't anybody who is being abused by a spouse or something like that just say, stop it? And we realize now that that's not as easy as it sounds.
By the end of the 5th day, 4 prisoners had broken down and been released. 416 was on the 2nd day of his hunger strike, and the experiment still had another 9 days to run.
God damn.
At this point, a fellow psychologist visited Zimbardo's basement prison and would witness the brutality of the experiment firsthand.
The guards had lined up the prisoners to go to the toilet, had bags over their head, chains on their feet, and were marching by. And I looked up and I saw this circus, this parade, and I said, hey, Chris, look at that.
I looked up and I just began to feel sick to my stomach. I had this just chilling, sickening feeling of watching this. And I just, I just turned away. And I just let loose in this emotional tirade. I just lost it. I was angry, scared. I was in tears.
And I'm furious. I'm saying, you're supposed to, we had a big argument. You're supposed to be a psychologist. This is this interesting dynamic behavior in such a few days. But I'm going through this whole thing, the power of the situation. She says, no, it's that young boys are suffering, and you are responsible. You're letting it happen. I said, oh my God, I wish you were right.
The next day, Zimbardo ended the experiment. Studies like his stimulated heated debate about the ethics of using human subjects.
Clearly, young men suffered, verbally, physically. Prisoners felt shame in their role. Guards felt guilt. So in that sense, it's unethical. That is, nobody has the right, the power, the privilege to do that to other people.
In the wake of experiments like Zimbardo's and Milgram's, ethical guidelines changed, introducing greater safeguards to protect participants. In the Stanford experiment, Zimbardo might have spared his volunteers distress had he not taken on a dual role in the study.
If I was going to be the prison superintendent, I should have had a colleague who was overseeing the experiment, who was in a position to stop it at any point, or I should have been the principal investigator and get somebody who was going to be the prison superintendent. I realized that was a big mistake, to play both those roles and be shifting back and forth.
You could have made the superintendent another college kid.
After the experiment, Zimbardo brought all the participants together to talk about their experiences. John Wayne would now come face to face with the hunger striker he had tormented.
I was a little worried. I said, oh my God, he's really going to come down on me hard now, now that we're on equal footing.
It harms me.
How did it harm you? How does it harm you? Just to think about it, you mean that people can be like that?
Yeah. It let me in on some knowledge that I've never experienced firsthand. Because I know what you can turn into. I know what you're willing to do.
When I look back on it now, I behaved appallingly. It was just horrid to look at. I think I tried to explain to him at the time that, what you experienced and what you hated so much was a role that I was playing, that's not me at all.
He was trying to dissociate himself from what he had done. That did make me angry. Everyone was acting out a part and playing a role. Prisoners, guards, staff, everyone was acting out a part. It's when you start contributing to the script, that's you. And thus it's something you should take responsibility for.
I didn't see where it was really harmful. It was degrading, and that was part of my particular little experiment to see how I could...
Your particular little experiment.
Yes,
Why don't you tell me about that?
I was running little experiments of my own.
Tell me about your little experiments.
Okay.
I'm curious.
I wanted to see just what kind of verbal abuse that people can take before they start objecting, before they start flashing back.
If I have any regret right now, it's that, I made that decision, because it would have been interesting to see what would have happened had I not decided to force things. It could be that I only accelerated them, that the same things would have happened, but we'll never know.
If the extreme nature of Dave Eshelman's behavior tested the prisoners, it also presented the other guards with a choice, to intervene or not.
Right.
It surprised me that no one said anything to stop me. They just accepted what I said, and no one questioned my authority at all.
And that's the problem. Like I said earlier, you have too many followers, not enough people that want to lead or think independently. It's always the same narrative, and you either believe it or you're wrong.
And it really shocked me. Why didn't people, when I started to abuse people so much, I started to get so profane that, and still people didn't say anything.
There were a few guards who hated to see the prisoners suffer. They never did anything which would be demeaning of the prisoners. The interesting thing is, none of the good guards ever intervened in the behavior of the guards who gradually became more and more sadistic over time. We like to think there is this core of human nature that good people can't do bad things and that good people will dominate over bad situations. In fact, one way to look at the Stanford Prison Study is that we put good people in an evil place and we saw who won. Well, the sad message is, in this case, the evil place won over the good people.
It did show some very interesting and maybe some unpleasant things about human behavior. It seems like, every century, every decade that we go through, we're suffering the same kind of atrocities, and you need to understand why these things happen. You need to understand why people behave like this.
I don't know what to tell you. 3 different experiments, 3 different decades, and all similar experiment. to fuck with your mind and see how they can manipulate you and push you in a direction that they want you to go. Because, well, fuck, man. Yeah. It's on the big screen every day. Mainstream media, TV, movies. All a reality of life that people think is just fantasy. And that means you being manipulated to think everything is all, shits and giggles? No. Poops and starflies, ice creams and cakes. I don't really know if there's a phrase like that, but I'll make it up. Farts and sprinkles. But, was going to do 2 more, but it looks like the audience died down, and so motivation's gone. Anyway, hope y'all enjoyed the social experiments of our government. Sorry, not just our government, but our educational institutions. They conduct these experiments, and people don't know. Obviously, they don't know. Well, like, people like us don't know about it. It's crazy. But anyway, guys, I'm not telling you how to think. I'm just telling you to think. I just find it extremely odd that all this happens. But yeah. Alright. Yeah. Peace out. Music hit. Music hit. Music hit. Hello? What's going on?
And this is a friendship that'll never ever end.
What the hell is it? I don't know what happened. That was weird.